What's going on, guys? It's your boy Beatsbyash, back at it again with another banger of a video, and today is going to be the very first episode of a brand new series called Meta Mechanics. And for this one, we're going to be starting out with the deck that I feel I have the most merit to talk about at this point because of the knowledge and the amount of time I've spent on the deck out of the other decks in OPO5 so far, the purple Luffy. The focus of this series is going to be not as much on breaking down exactly what the deck does, but more so on what role each individual card plays in the deck, and as well a lot about the decision making and how to extract the most value of each card in the deck so that you know how to appropriately play your cards in sequence. One of the things that will happen in future episodes is that I'm going to open up some kind of option for either YouTube members or people of a specific patron tier on the Patreon, where you will get access to an exclusive link to watch me stream this content live. And at the end of the discussion, those who meet those criteria will have the opportunity to ask questions about the entire discussion and about the deck in general, and those questions and answers will be included in the video, which will be uploaded onto YouTube. And as well, with decks that I feel there is someone I personally know who is more of an expert or has value to add about that specific deck, then I will have an additional guest on so that we can give you guys the most value as possible. But that's kind of the gist of what this series is going to be about. Really hope you enjoy it, and let's go ahead and get into Purple Luffy. So to start things off, I kind of want to break down something that I've been thinking about for a while now, which is the way in which you take life with this leader. So essentially the game plan, I've found that most games you're going to start out using your ramp ability turn 2 and as well turn 3 about 95% of the time. And after you ramp for the second time, the third ramp and onward really starts to accrue a very high depreciating value in terms of what you're getting versus the cost of going down to a lesser life total. And this is not an absolute, because there are going to be some matchups and some game states where your opponent is aggressively pressuring you from the very beginning, maybe something like a Zoro strategy, where the cost may start depreciating after the first ramp. But in general, I've found that typically ramping on turn 2 and turn 3 is well worth the cost of losing a life. And with that in mind, when I played the Zoro strategy, I concluded that it was correct to take the first and second hit every single game until you get down to 3 life, and then once you're at 3 life, you would like to start defending your health total, because that's whenever you start having a depreciating value on needing to draw additional cards from your life. And as well, the cost to go down to 2 life in general is just a big drop-off point in terms of the potential for your opponent to actually end the game. And when we think about this philosophy and translate that over to the purple Luffy deck, I have a theory that it is correct to actually block the first hit every single time if it does not demand more than 1 card out of your hand. And the reason is that if we're going to be using the ramp ability of our leader on turn 2 and as well as turn 3 every single time, then we're essentially starting out at that 3 life threshold, which means if we want to be able to afford the cost associated with using the leader ability on these key turns, then we need to start protecting our health total early on so that we're not in a position for our opponent to just steal the game by going for lethal on a turn where we do not have the amount of blockers on board to mitigate such scenarios. So that's just a little bit of a tip that I found so far. As the format progresses and as I play in more events, my opinion may change, but I think that this is a good philosophy to follow in the beginning stages of the format, especially if we are expecting to see a similar metagame play out in the USA as did the representation of the Asia/Japanese meta. So with that out of the way, I want to talk a little bit about why this deck intrigues me so much versus previous strategies that kind of fit into the same archetype. Because in any card game, you have about 3 to 4 different kinds of play styles within, the decks available. Aggro, control, mid-range, and as well the fourth category would be ramp. Typically in a ramp deck, historically throughout card games, the greatest example would be one of my favorite decks in all of Magic the Gathering history, which is the Tron deck. If you know nothing about this deck, essentially the way that it plays out is imagine that you have different kinds of Dawn cards that have different effects on the game in terms of what they do. Instead of the Dawn starting outside of your deck, they are shuffled into your deck at the beginning of the game. And in this Tron deck, you had 3 different kinds of key Dawn, or in Magic the Gathering, land cards. And essentially, you can only play one of these land cards per turn. Conversely to One Piece, where you are getting 2 Dawn every single turn after the first turn. And once you assemble these 3 specific types of Dawn cards on the field, instead of adding 3 total mana or Dawn to what you can play from your hand this turn, if you had all 3 of them on the field at the same time, you could tap them all for a total of 7 Dawn or 7 mana. And because of this, the entire reason the deck was so powerful is around this linear game plan of trying to assemble these 3 specific pieces so that you could cheat out a high-costed card on a turn that you normally cannot do so with any other given strategy. And where the purple Luffy deck differs from this strategy, and as well the purple Kaido strategy, is that I think there is a lot more depth to how you want to use your cards, and it's a lot less linear than previous ramp strategies that have been successful in the history of card games in general, like the Tron deck, where your game plan was to get these pieces out as soon as possible and then play whatever card soaked up the most amount of mana so that you could get the most value out of assembling those pieces on an early turn. With the purple Luffy deck, I don't think that there are as many absolutes in terms of ramping outside of the philosophy that it's typically going to be correct for us to use the ramp ability on turn 2 and as well turn 3. There are a lot of different patterns associated with knowing when to use a card that returns a Dawn to the Dawn deck and knowing when to not use those effects so that you can set up for a later turn. This is kind of a mechanic or an aspect to a ramp deck that I have never really seen in previous card games in general. And, I think that really adds a lot of outplay potential or rewards players who put more time into learning this specific strategy, which is something that really attracts me because one of the main issues I've had with One Piece so far, I was extremely incentivized at the beginning of set 1 and the conception of the game to put in a lot of time because I felt that it was very difficult for anyone who just started the game to learn how to efficiently and effectively attack and as well counter in a short amount of time. And in the beginning, I felt like I had a strong grasp on this aspect of the game a lot sooner than the total sum of all the One Piece players in the card game. So it felt very rewarding in the beginning stages of the game to put in a lot of time. And since then, with the way that cards have been power creeped, that skill gap has really diminished in terms of the rewards you were getting back for the amount of time being put into the game. And what I mean by this is, now that the typical player in the One Piece card game has a greater grasp on how to appropriately attack and defend, and now that there is more information on this huge aspect to the skill of the game, you need to find new ways in order to separate yourself from the other players. And with the cards that we saw in OPO 2 through OPO 4, they kind of just, in general, didn't add additional complexity or strategy to the gameplay itself, and more so just power creeped out the previous cards in terms of stat lines alone. So in general, when new decks come out, you would like in a card game that it requires a different level of skill or introduces a different way to play the game so that you can gain a technical play advantage over other players by mastering this strategy. And I would argue that there is a little bit of that with the support that came before OPO 5, but in general, the support before OPO 5 has not really asked a lot more from the typical player who has already mastered attacking and defending correctly to put more time into the game to effectively pilot these newer strategies such as Katakuri, Grape Doflamingo, or any of the decks that came out in OPO 3, OPO 4. It really hasn't added a lot of layers to the complexity of technical play itself. I think that with the purple Luffy deck, it does add new complexities to the gameplay, for the reason being that previously in the only other ramp strategy that was ever really even potentially playable, being the purple Kaido deck, it was very linear with the way that you wanted to play your stage as soon as possible. And in general, it didn't matter if you had a minus Dawn effect. You were almost forced to just play whatever the highest cost card in your hand was on a given turn, because if you didn't, you would get set back greatly in tempo from the other player. Whereas with the purple Luffy deck, one of the key features is that we haven't really had the opportunity to choose when we should use these minus Dawn effects to this extent, because they generally haven't been that good. And if they were, then the cards that you have to play in the early game in order to not get left behind really just forced you to do whatever was going to give you the largest tempo swing to get back on the board. And with the leader not requiring us to play any ramp specific cards in the early game and guaranteeing us the option to be able to ramp every single turn after the start of the game, it adds a lot of optionality and versatility to the outplay potential or technical play that you can have on the game. And I think that's a very neat feature of this deck. And that is one of the best reasons to play this strategy. In my opinion, I feel like the closest thing we've had in the game so far to a successful ramp strategy would be the yellow Katakuri deck, because while it does not use any ramp cards specifically, their top end cards before OPO 5 and even more so before OPO 4 were generally speaking on a higher level of card quality than the top end of every other deck in the game at that moment. And you had a sufficient amount of early game plays that you didn't really ever get left behind in tempo unless you went against a super aggressive Zoro strategy. So in general, you were essentially trying to get to the late game as fast as possible so you could cheat out your fat guys, which is synonymous to any other ramp strategy. With that being said, I do feel like that deck's plays are very linear and follows that same philosophy that you're trying to play whatever the highest cost card is from your hand so that you can get back on the board and survive until the late game so you can drop down your bombs that are just on a higher power interval than everyone else's. So it really made for a simplistic way to approach the game. And as well, that made the mirror match very simplistic. A lot of the time, it would come down to who got to go second and who had more big moms in their hand, mostly coming down to who put the first big mom on the field, because a 12k power interval at the release of yellow was very, very difficult to Dawn efficiently remove that card from the field or answer it. You could still make a similar claim to this day because that card is just very difficult to interact with and has very few downsides to putting it on the board as soon as you can. And that really drove me away from that deck, being that I generally enjoy these ramp strategies. As I noted, Tron is one of my favorite decks of all time, but because the mirror match was so popular and as well so linear, it didn't make me feel rewarded for putting additional time into learning what is the best thing to do in the deck at a given time. Whereas in Purple Luffy, I do feel that there is a lot of outplay potential in the mirror match, and you can't say that in general about a large majority of decks in the One Piece card game, which offers a great incentive to players who want to put the time in and understand these interactions. Firstly, we're going to go ahead and go over some of the cards that I feel have the most merit in the deck and how to appropriately use them. And then at the end of the video, I'm going to go ahead and note a couple of cards that I am currently not playing, but I do think have merits in the deck depending on what you are meta calling or what you are expecting to go against in a large event. So starting off, as I noted, since we do want to ramp on turn 2 and as well turn 3, in order to maximize these ramping effects on the game and not pay too high of a cost, it makes the most sense that we want to try to go first if given the opportunity in most matchups. So the ideal curve is that turn 1, you are never going to have a play, and turn 2, you want to play a 4-drop by using our ramp effect, and turn 3, you want to play a 7-drop in order to maximize those additional Dawn gained. And for that reason, I think that it is mandatory to play 8 total copies of a 4-cost 6,000 power character. In my instance, I am currently playing 4 Scratch Mana Poo and 4 Page 1. The reason I think that 8 4-cost vanillas is necessary in this strategy is because since we're paying such a high cost to lose a life and ramp up a Dawn, we need to develop a body that is not going to require much of a cost in terms of attacking. And 4-cost 6k is currently the premier stat line in terms of the vanilla test for the game at that interval. And if you don't open a 4-cost 6k, a lot of times you're going to get behind in tempo in the early game. And at that point, you are already at a disadvantage because you are most likely going to be forced to ramp on the 3rd turn as well. And so if you get your body removed because it's too small or it doesn't have a great enough effect on the game, your opponent is going to be able to pressure you before you develop a board that is large enough to stop focusing on developing strong attackers and start developing multiple blockers in a turn towards the latter end of a game. And for that reason, 8 4-cost 6Ks really makes sense, because if we are using our leader ability, we're going to have a total of 7 cards seen, which means at that point, we will have a 77% chance to draw a 4-costed character by turn 2. And this is excluding the potential for us to use a mulligan. And I would highly recommend that in most matchups, you are going to want to mulligan for a 4-costed character because the sunken cost of missing that 4-cost drop is just very, very high. And it is not the same to play out something like your 4-cost ulti or your 4-cost Trafalgar Law, because the difference between a 5k and a 6k character is actually quite a bit greater than you would think, considering we want to be using all of our Dawn every single turn so that we get the most out of using our leader ability. A 6,000 power character is going to either attack and demand a 2k, or we can attach 1 Dawn, which in some scenarios you will have specifically 1 Dawn left, and in that instance you're going to be able to hit for 7k. So the opportunity cost there is very large to miss that, and there are also other merits to not playing your ulti and not playing your Law on the second turn and using those abilities, because then that messes up our potential to maximize using the ramp ability turn 2 and as well turn 3, because we are now behind an additional Dawn. So if you are playing out those characters because you do not have a 4-cost 6k, I would say in most instances you are more likely than not going to want to not pay the cost of ulti or Law, because it's going to set you back too far behind with the curve that we are looking to get to. So 8 4-cost 6Ks I think is mandatory. I think that additional copies are not really necessary in the deck because of mulliganing, because we're seeing additional cards with our leader ability. And as well, it's not the worst thing to have to put out a Law. There are going to be some specific implications to doing that on turn 2, which I will go over later in the video. Moving on to the 2k counters, I think this is the most flexible part of the deck. And the reason I say that is because as I have played more and more in this game, and as I have performed well in high-level events, I have started to put a lower weight on having 2k counters in my deck. And in general, that is because 2k counters make sense when you're starting out in the game, but as you start to learn that most of the 2k counters outside of red are basically a blanket effect on the game, meaning that the value they provide by playing themselves on the board is typically not sufficient enough to forego playing with one less 2k counter. And that's one of the main reasons that I resonated so well with the Zoro strategy up to this point, because that deck allowed you to only play 8 2k counters, being 4 Brook and 4 Makino, and Brook and Makino are, in my opinion, the 2 best 2k counters in the game, because more often than I would like to hold the 2k counter, the pressure and the value that is provided by playing those cards onto the battlefield is higher than keeping the counter in hand. And you can't say that about really any other deck in the game. For that reason, the purple decks in general don't have a large incentive to be playing a high amount of 2k counters, other than when you're using your 7-cost Captain Kid, you can extract a little bit more value from 2ks than other players, because if your opponent is attacking for a 7k power interval, you're going to 8 with a 2k. And in my opinion, that's still not enough of an incentive for me to put cards in my deck that only have one purpose. One of the biggest advantages to the Zoro deck, you barely played any cards in your deck at all that had no counter value, and the few cards that did, being the event package, also had multiple purposes other than countering, being the implications with the 5-cost Marco, and in terms of Fire Fist specifically, the interactions with the 4-cost Marco, and the positive effect on your deck that you gain from having those keywords being the Straw Hat and Whitebeard Pirates tags because of the searchers that you played. In general, in the purple Luffy deck, there's only one 2K that I think is mandatory, being the 4-cost 5K ulti, and this card is not even that insane of an effect. Like I said, more often than not, you would like to not play this on turn 2, because reducing your Dawn at that key turn is so much of a cost that it oftentimes can be worse for you to develop 2 bodies and set yourself back a Dawn, and rather just develop 1 and still hit 7 Dawn on turn 3. But ulti does have a specific guaranteed implication in a few matchups, one of them being the Zoro matchup specifically, where against very aggressive decks, you want to try to get on board as early as possible, because the aggressive strategies are trying to exploit our cost to playing this strategy, where essentially we are foregoing developing a threat on the board in the early portions of the game so that we can gain a greater effect in the latter end of the match. But in those key matchups, presenting 2 bodies on the board is very impactful. And I think that because this card has specific implications in certain matchups, it holds a higher weight than any of the other 2K counters. I think all of the other potential 2Ks have very minuscule effects on the board and could be easily swapped out and or removed. A good example of this is Miss Doublefinger, which is one I see people play a lot, and as well the Franosuke. Franosuke, if you want to put him on the board, you are going to be paying 5 Dawn to play him, and as well 1 Dawn to attack in order to actually get value from the card. And you think about that rate, you are paying 6 Dawn in order to attack the other player for 5,000 power immediately. And when you compare that to the current rate of a 3-cost 5K Rush Zoro, that is not a good rate by any means. And when you think about what our deck is doing, we should not be starved of ways to utilize all of our Dawn in the late game compared to any other given strategy. And since you have to have 8 or more Dawn on the field to even use this effect, I would argue that about 95% of the time, you are never going to want to use this ability, and it will not be the correct thing to do. Whereas with ulti, it's not something that you want to do on turn 2 every single time, and it's not something you want to do in every matchups, but there is at least a realistic, specific reason for you to be using this effect. Similarly to Miss Doublefinger, this card requires you to neg 1 Dawn in order to put it on the battlefield. On top of that, because it is 4,000 power, you're also having to invest an additional Dawn to even make this an attacker. And when you think about it in that regard, you're essentially also paying 6 Dawn to attack for 5 if you trigger it during your opponent's turn, which puts it into the same basket as Franosuke. And I think for that reason, these cards could be easily changed out or exchanged. I think that out of the 2Ks available, X-Drake has the next highest ceiling to what you could actually get out of this card, because there might be some games where your opponent adds a card you specifically know, like using a Nami in a game state where your opponent added a Radical Beam and then they only have 1 card in hand, and you know that using X-Drake forces them to discard a key card that you specifically know about, then this card might actually come into play. And since you're only going to be really playing this card at the latter end of the game, the minus Dawn effect is irrelevant. So you think about, at least this card is a 5 for a 5,000 power character with an effect that makes your opponent discard a card. I think that that effect can be weighted appropriately to an additional Dawn if you know what you're getting out of your opponent's hand with that effect. And for that reason, the rate of what you're paying to get this value on the board with this card is held in much higher regard than the Miss Double Finger or the Franisuki, but still, I also just think that this deck already has more things to do at the end of the game than any other strategy, so you will most likely not be using that ability, but out of the ones available, I think it's the most likely to come up after the ulti. Moving on to the next key turn in our curve, which is turn 3, since we want to be using a 7-costed character to get the most value out of our leader ability, I am maximizing on 4 Poly and as well 4 copies of 7-cost Captain Kidd. A lot of people have a misconception about this deck, and I've seen people play only 3 Captain Kidd. I think people just assume that the way you win the game is by 9-cost Kaido, and I think that that is not necessarily true, and that the large majority of the time, 7-cost Kidd is going to be the best card in your deck, and the more often that you see this card, the more likely you are to win the match, especially in certain matchups where forcing your opponent to be taxed an additional Dawn to attack is going to have a larger impact on the game. But the ceiling on 7-cost Captain Kidd is much higher than any other card you could be playing on this turn, considering that when you have multiple, you can get your leader up to 7 or 8,000 during your opponent's turn. And when you think about the ceiling of this card and compare it to other considerable drops at this point in the game, the rate that you are getting for the cost is very, very exceptional. I like to compare this to using the Whitebeard leader. The reason why Whitebeard was good is because the majority of characters you're playing have a minimum power of 6,000 other than your searchers, which means that if you're attacking and I have a 6,000 power character on the board and my leader is 6,000, no matter which way you want to go, you're going to be taxed 1 Dawn to make that attack. I think that used as Captain Kidd takes that interaction to a different level. Let's say I actually played 1 Kidd this turn and I attacked with another Kidd, and now my leader is 7,000 power. Well, now if they want to attack my leader, they're going to be taxed 2 Dawn, and in that instance, your opponent is typically going to look at challenging a character on the board that they could get a better rate of attack. But considering 7-cost Kidd has 8,000 power, even when your leader is at 7,000 power, it's typically still going to be the best thing for your opponent to invest in attack or invest Dawn to attack during that turn. And that is exceptional because especially against lower to the ground strategies where the vast majority of their characters are starting at 5,000 or below, the rate of tax is so high that even though we might be at 2 or 1 life, it's going to be very difficult for your opponent to close out the game or successfully clear our board. On top of the fact that removal for 7-cost characters at this power interval is very, very premium at this current point in the game. There are ways to get around it, such as having a 4-cost Kuzan on the board, which in my opinion is one of the best counters to the deck currently, but in general, it's going to cost your opponent either a lot of resources using 1 card or multiple cards in order to answer that card. And so typically the 7-cost Kidd is going to be the best thing you could be playing on turn 3, assuming you're on the play, and as well a large portion of the time also on the draw. So this card can actually be very valuable to mulligan for in certain matchups. Number 1, the Zoro matchup, as well the Yellow Enel matchup. I think this card is very pivotal in both of those because they both have characters that are 5,000 power or 6,000 power, and the taxation this card provides just extracts a lot of value in those matchups. And the reason why I think Poly is also a necessary card in the deck is because, as I've noted, the biggest counter is your opponent plays a 4-cost Kuzan on their second turn, and if they do so and you don't have an answer on the following turn, whatever 7 drop or 8 drop you inevitably play is going to be removed from your board without requiring your opponent to really utilize any resources at all. And when that happens, you think about it like this. We have just lost 2 life in order to cheat out a very high value character. And if we don't have anything else on the board and our opponent gets to remove that for free while also developing their own threat during that turn, you essentially lose the game because your opponent already has control of the board and you're already at a low life interval to where it's going to be very easy for your opponent to actually close out the game, resulting in a lot of auto losses. And that's why Poly is very pivotal to the deck, because if you were able to remove their 4-cost Kuzan and then ramp an additional Dawn, that's doing 2 things. You're mitigating an auto loss, you're developing a character that demands an answer, and on top of that, you're also ramping an additional Dawn, which means on the very next turn, you're most likely going to have 0 punishment for not utilizing your leader ability a 3rd time during the game, and as well, you're going to feel better about using minus Dawn effects going forward, because if you were at 7, well then now you're going to be at 10 on the following turn, which means you have more liberty and more options to actually make the best course of action in the game state, regardless of what the costs of your cards are, being the return to the Dawn deck mechanic, such as the 9-cost Kaido, which can win a lot of games off of playing a Poly, because then at that point, when you get to the turn after playing the 9-cost Kaido, you're not going to be set back in terms of your Dawn to a large extent to where you feel forced to use your leader ability an additional time just to play another card on the field that actually has an impact. So for that reason alone, I think Poly is very, very important in the deck. And on top of that, by turn 3, if we're playing 8 7-drop characters and I'm categorizing Poly as a 7-drop, not a 5-drop, because there are very few merits to playing it with only 5 Dawn, you have a 86% chance to see one of these 8 7 drops, because you will have seen a total of 9 cards at that point, and this is also not including the mulligan rule, which is very important because hitting your turn 2 play that uses up all of your Dawn, and as well as your turn 3 play that uses all of your Dawn, I think has a greater weight on the game than any other aspect that could be involved during that match. So regardless of whether your opponent is playing Sakazuki, I think even when you're able to kill a weenie that your opponent was planning on attacking with on the following turn, or maybe they're on yellow and you attacked first and they triggered a character, anytime you can get any amount of value from playing Poly, it's still going to be worth it because it is the second best action we can be making on turn 3 to use up all of the Dawn we've accrued over using our leader ability for the second and third turn of the game. Moving on to the latter portions of the game, I've seen some people play 2 9-cost Kaido, I've seen others play 4. I like to play 3, and my reasoning is that if you can curve Poly into a 9-cost Kaido, it is a very strong interaction, really mitigating the cost associated with this card. And if you read the card as this card does not require you to return any Dawn to the Dawn deck, which is exactly what this card does, unless you have multiple in your hand, because every other card that we have in the deck can be played at the 8 Dawn turning point of the game. And so really, I don't think there's a large incentive to drawing multiple of this card in your hand. While it does have a big impact being the first time that you were able to play him during the game. And so I think 3 is the appropriate amount of copies to play in the deck. You could argue for playing 1 less copy or 1 more copy, but this is just my opinion at this point in the format. Removing a body with Poly, no matter how low costed, and then after removing a body with Kaido, is very, very impactful. and creates a large snowball effect on the game where it becomes extremely difficult for you to lose beyond that point. And even if you played a 7-cost kid previously and you chose not to activate the effect on field, putting a 9-cost Kaido on the following turn is such a large tempo swing that you are likely going to want to see one copy during the game, and especially at that point in the game, but it is not necessary to win. One big thing that I forgot to mention is with the 7-cost kid, I'm pretty confident that it is not an absolute for you to use the effect of 7-cost kid during the first turn it is played. If you are still at 3 life on turn 3 and your opponent does not have a large board presence, because this can mitigate your potential to play the 9-cost Kaido on the following turn, and as well it can require you to use your leader ability an additional time on turn 4, which is something that we've already addressed has a very high diminishing rate of return at that point in the game. And I think that's something people will struggle with very early on, and it's something you want to be thinking about. What is the opportunity cost of me using the effect on play to reduce my Dawn for the next turn? Because if you were developing back-to-back large drops that the average player was not able to put on the board at that turn, your opponent is going to have to put a higher priority on answering your threats rather than attacking your health total on the following turn. So while it may seem urgent to use this ability on play, if you can afford to not do it on the first turn that it's played, and it has a large incentive with the hand that you have and what you would be able to put on the board on the following turn, you would much rather not do so. And especially because if your opponent has an answer for this, they're going to have to answer it. And if we say that our opponent is going to use a 8-cost Katakuri on the following turn to answer the kid, as that is one of the best answers, then your opponent is going to be left with 0 Dawn. Or even if they used a modifier in Sakazuki and then a card to kill that card, they most likely will not be able to afford to invest any Dawn in their leader to attack your leader, which means you realistically only need one 1k counter to mitigate a crucial damage at that point in the game, adding more evidence to my reasoning that 2k counters don't have as large of an impact on this strategy as most people would assume. One other thing I would like to note about the 9-drop Kaido and why I only play 3 is that in the purple Luffy matchup, I think this card is very important to actually win the game. I think that is the matchup that this card has the highest weight, as it is very difficult for the other player to answer this card depending on their board state. I talked to Joey Lynch about this, and I've talked to a couple other really good players in the entire card game community, and come to the consensus that if there is a card that you want to be able to mulligan for, 3 copies is most likely the correct amount to play to look for a key card in a specific matchup. Moving on to post turn 4 of the game, at this point, we're typically going to be at either 1 or 2 life. It is very unlikely that you will actually be at 3 life by this point, and for that reason, there becomes a very high sunken cost to actually defending your health total if you have another option available. And that's where cards such as our 5-cost Captain Kid blocker, our 5-cost Queen blocker, and our 4-cost Trafalgar Law blocker really come into play. The reason I play 4 Trafalgar Law blocker is because I think there's a large weight past turn 4 for you to be able to play down 2 blockers in a single turn. I think that is a much better investment in using your Dawn than playing another aggressive drop at this point in the game and just trying to protect your 1 or 2 life available, as if you are maximizing on all of these cards, you are going to be able to consistently play 2 blockers when you're at that 2 life interval, and at that point, you can choose to just take the damage, either going down to 1 or 0, just to see more cards, because you're going to be most likely closing out the game on the following turn if your opponent cannot push through. And outside your opponent playing Law or Zoro and being able to use a Rush Zoro, it is very difficult at this current point in the game to efficiently answer 2 large statted blockers in the same turn, and as well push through for lethal damage. And so I think there is a much higher weight on using a double spell or playing 2 blockers in one turn towards the latter end of the match, and that's a large incentive to maximize on the best blockers available. So obviously, the 5-cost Captain Kidd, this card meets the Marco stat line, being a 5-cost 6k with a 1k counter, which means it is most likely going to be in the top end of the blockers we want to play to maximize our double spell potential, as 5 is the highest cost we can afford to play in order to put out 2 sizable blockers. The way that you should approach this effect of returning a Dawn to the Dawn deck actually adds back the same Dawn as active is, instead of saying your cards with a minus Dawn effect have no cost, you can assume at this point in the game your cards that have a minus Dawn effect actually ramp you an additional Dawn. And the reason I say this is because once you're past turn 4 or later in the game, if you are only at 9 Dawn and you have a Eustace Captain Kidd 5-drop and as well a Queen blocker, but you already have a 7-cost Captain Kidd on the board, then you can pay 5 Dawn to play your Captain Kidd 5-drop, which leaves us at 4. And then if you attack with your 7-cost Kidd afterward and return a rested Dawn, now granting you the same Dawn back as active, you are now playing with 10 Dawn instead of 9 Dawn, which I found to be very relevant, because the difference between playing 1 blocker and 2 blockers at the end of the game is very, very distant. And then following that up, you can utilize your Queen, which will then discard a card with no counter, hopefully generating you 1 or 2 new cards with a counter value. Is just such a high level of insurance that your opponent will most likely not be able to push through for lethal or be able to even kill your characters that are blocking, because if your Queen is granting you additional counter by discarding cards that have no counter, you're more than likely going to be able to block with a 6,000 power character and as well protect that character in a very efficient way. So I think these 2 cards are the most important blockers to play. And then Law is very, very close to not being in the deck at a maximized amount of 4 copies. But I do think that since I want to have a minimum of 12 blockers that can be played in conjunction to apply 2 blockers to the board at the same time at the latter end of the game, that this is the 3rd best blocker we could be playing at that point in the game. And as well, it is a very versatile card. Even if you don't use this ability, it is still a fair stat line, as in general, the blocker keyword makes up for either a counter or an additional power. And when you look at it like this is essentially the same value as a 4-cost 6k vanilla, which means that it is meeting the stat line criteria of what we're trying to do, regardless of whether you use the effect. A very important implication to note with the 4-cost Law is that if you are on the play and you attack with your leader before making any action on turn 2, assuming your opponent did not throw out a 2-cost or less chump blocker onto the battlefield, or they missed a search, they are going to have 6 cards in hand. And considering that most decks at this point in the game want to take the first hit, if they do end up taking the first hit and you don't have a guaranteed 7-drop for the following turn, then you can use this ability starting on turn 2 to take 2 cards out of your opponent's hand And depending on what matchup it is and what cards you are planning on playing on the following turn, this can be a very, very good way to disrupt your opponent from curving out in the way that they would like, almost acting as a similar role player to the next card we will get into, which is the 5-cost Magellan. As being randomized is just such a high impact at this point in the game, especially when there are a lot of decks that have cards which only do B if you can also do A. Something like a Ohm, which is the 4-cost 5,000 power character in the Anel deck. If you are able to snipe the Holy, which is the vanilla dog, out of their hand, or the Ohm itself, the card that they are left with in their hand has a very diminished value. Or in the Sakazuki matchup, discarding a modifier in their hand when they actually only have left a kill spell, such as the 4-cost Rob Lucci, can really disrupt your opponent from doing what they wanted to accomplish, even if it isn't going to affect them on the following turn. So it's very important to attack with your leader on turn 2 of the game and see if your opponent takes the damage before making any decisions, because this is an applicable interaction that I have found come up several times. Now, the last key role player I would mention in the deck is Magellan. While Poly is extremely beneficial in the Sakazuki matchup, Magellan is going to be vastly beneficial against the Anel matchup, and also very beneficial when you are forced to go second, because I like to build decks and play the game, especially in a best of one card game, to where if I lose the die roll, I can still play the game. But if we do get to win the die roll, we still have a large impact on the game. Because in best of one, if you lose one time because of the die roll, that can end your tournament experience, especially if you get that loss at the very beginning of the tournament. And that's why it's very important to play Magellan, as it covers the other area of decks in the game that Poly does not. An example of this would be if you were forced to go second against a yellow Anel player, in turn 2, you cheated out a Magellan and activated effect. Number 1, on the following turn, if we use our leader ability again, we are still going to be able to cheat out a 7-drop, which is very important. And on top of that, we're going to stop our opponent from using a key card one turn sooner, such as a Katakuri or a 7-cost yellow Anel, depending on whether you were going first or second at that time. And I think that there is a big decision to be made with Magellan when you have 2 copies in your hand, because there's going to be some situations where the opportunity cost of playing a second Magellan back to back actually exceeds the value being presented by cheating out a 7-drop Eustace Kid during that turn. And I infer that that's going to be a very big decision point during the duration of this meta. So that is something very important to look out for. But in general, one thing you have to think about, big picture of this strategy, is that considering this is one of the only decks in the game that has had a vast amount of success without utilizing any amount of searchers, the reason why that is, even if we don't draw the specific card we want to play out on a key turn, there are enough cards that are adequately substituted into that role that it doesn't matter if we don't specifically draw 9-cost Kaido or 7-drop Kid. And for that reason, maximizing on both Magellan and as well Poly, in my opinion, is going to be very important to maximize the consistency of a leader that does not possess any searchers to guarantee key cards during very pivotal turns. One thing that a lot of people are probably thinking is that by applying this rule, we're actually playing a very high amount of non-counter cards, which is something that I don't like to do when approaching this game, as my last Zoro list in the previous meta possessed very few non-counter cards, with only one way to utilize the card in the given strategy. Considering the non-counter cards in our deck are very important to take advantage of the 2 turns we will most likely be ramping, there are not very many substitutes on the same power level that can be adequately swapped out and also have a 1k counter. The rate that you're getting with cards that are in these slots of the Magellan and the Poly that provide a 1k counter are really just not on the same level and do not provide the same amount of value as these cards do. It's kind of just a necessary evil to maximize on these no counter cards in order to justify losing the 2 life with our leader that we most likely will be doing in just about every single game. The one way that I've found to currently best counteract this disadvantage of the deck is by playing 3 copies of Gum Gum Jet Gatling. This is the 0 cost event that provides a 3k counter for an attack if you discard another card. And I think that this kind of effect has been seen in other decks before, but in my opinion, this is the deck that can extract the most value from playing a card like this. And that's because our best cards are the non-counter cards, which means we really need a way to get rid of duplicates out of our hand. Considering there are no searchers available to us to find these copies of key cards on specific pivotal turns, we need to maximize on those cards to guarantee that we don't just ramp 2 times and not get to utilize the full value of the Dawn we gained. And so oftentimes you are going to hit your curve of playing a 4-drop 6k and then playing either a Eustace Kid or a Poly, but you may also draw an additional copy of one of those, and that's why the Gum Gum Jet Gatling is very important, as having cards in your deck that only have one purpose throughout the game can be a very big disadvantage in just about any deck you're playing. And so Gum Gum Jet Gatling almost removes that disadvantage we are experiencing. I think that's a big reason to validate my proposition of currently playing 3 copies. I've seen some people only play 2 and mess around with other events, but I think this is the most important one. And to me, 3 copies is the best ratio because you're realistically going to get a large amount of value out of seeing the first copy. But once again, seeing the second copy of this card really has high diminishing returns. Out of the cards you're drawing that have no counter, generally speaking, most of them you would like to play if you have the opportunity to do so, considering they're the most powerful cards in our deck. But if you have a second Gum Gum Jet Gatling and you're towards the latter end of the game, you're most likely going to have very few cards in hand, leaving you with potentially only 1 card that you would like to discard, and so clumping can be a very big issue. Although Queen does slightly solve this issue as well, I don't think that card alone has a large enough effect on the amount of non-counter cards that we are playing and the amount of duplicates we will be seeing. This is where I think the other portion of the deck can be customized, and this could be messed around with to find the correct solution to the deck, is the event package and the 2k counter package. As I noted, the 2k counters do not hold a very high weight outside of ulti, and as well, I think other events besides Gum Gum Jet Gatling also hold an equivalent weight to playing the excess 2k counters, but because we have a sufficient amount of aggressive cards, this is the one area where you can actually mess around with these ratios. One of the options available is Blast Breath. Now, this card seems like an amazing card because we saw that Radical Beam was banned, so we know that this effect is very strong in the game. And a lot of people would like to read this card as the minus Dawn effect is essentially free because of the strategy we're playing, and the amount of ramp we will be experiencing, and that is true, but not to the same extent of Radical Beam. I feel that this card does have justification if you would like to play 1 or 2 copies, but at the moment, I'm not sold that this is equivalent to playing a Radical Beam, nor do I think that you 100% need an effect like this in the game. Because realistically, this is only going to be equivalent to a Radical Beam when you are at turn 4 or higher, because that's the point when this card realistically no longer has a cost associated with getting 4,000 power. But at the same time, that's when we want to be playing down 2 blockers. So in that scenario, you may not actually need this card at that point in the game. And since those blockers have a higher window of turns you can actually play them outside of just the latter end of the game, those cards hold a higher weight in our deck. While as Blast Breath is a situational Radical Beam that often you may not even have the Dawn to play this card during your opponent's turn, even if it is the latter end of the game, or even if it's early in the game and you think you're willing to sacrifice returning a Dawn to the Dawn deck before you hit 10, because you do just want to be utilizing every Dawn available in order to maximize the leader ability. And so for that reason, I think that you could remove a 2K counter to play a Blast Breath, but they probably hold about the same weight, and I don't think that that weight is nearly as high as something like Gum Gum Jet Gatling. Now, the other option available is an event that I've seen a few people play, and it is Sheep's Horn. This is the 2-cost event, active main, Dawn -1, rest a character with a cost of 6 or less, and this card also has no trigger. One thing I did want to mention, I just forgot, Gum Gum Jet Gatling's trigger says that you can add 1 Dawn from your Dawn deck and set it as active, which is equivalently very impactful in this deck. If you do trigger this card during your opponent's turn, and you know on the following turn you're going to be forced to utilize your leader ability again, I would say that more often than not, it's probably going to be worth it, depending on your hand, to just ramp via this effect. That way you are leaving an additional card in your life, rather than using this as a defensive tool, as it requires you to make a 2-for-1, and this really only becomes valuable if you can discard a specific duplicate non-counter card. But back to what I was saying about Sheep's Horn, the weight of this card is very meta dependent. As I noted, the biggest weakness to this deck is if your opponent plays a 4-cost Sakazuki and you have no answer on the following turn. And that's where I think that Sheep's Horn can be very valuable if people are playing a lot of blue-black Sakazuki at the top tables at these big events and you are meta calling to go against them. Because this card has a limited amount of applications across other matchups, but when you get into the situation where if you don't have an answer for a Kuzan, you automatically lose, it makes a lot of sense that if you can assume that you're going to play against a large majority of Sakazuki players out of a 9-round tournament, this card holds a lot of value as we can still rest their Kuzan and then challenge it and attack it with our leader, or later in the game, we can play this card and as well develop a big body. You could also play this card and develop a Magellan on that same turn if you did not have a Poly. So the way that I would look at this card is it's additional copies of Poly with a lower level of versatility. There's going to be a limited amount of cards you actually want to rest with this effect. Those cards can also be answered more efficiently with your 9-cost Kaido or your 7-cost Poly. So this is essentially a slightly worse version and an additional copy of playing Poly, which also does not have major implications in every single matchup. To sum things up, these are the cards that I am most interested in playing in this given strategy going forward with the beginning of this format. And if my opinions change, I will potentially update you guys with another video or include it into a segment of a video we do with a different archetype. But that's going to be it for today. If you guys have any questions about the deck, or you have different opinions about my way to approach the deck and how to effectively pilot this strategy, make sure to let me know down below in the comments. If you got this far in the video, thank you so much for watching. And hopefully when we get the next one set up, we can get the opportunity for some people to ask questions live. But as always, if it's not the goo, it's got to go. Peace.
Ooh, is that indigo?